This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Wednesday, March 11th, 2026. A brief word before we begin today's episode. Last week, the Institute wrapped up its 94th annual Ottawa Conference on Security and Defense. I'd like to give a shout out to my CDAI colleagues who worked tirelessly on the conference over the past several months. Conference with over 500 attendees, featuring delegates and leading defense experts and officials from around the world, is a marathon and no small feat for a small but dedicated team like ours. This week, we'll be releasing our annual Ottawa Conference recap podcast, featuring highlights from panels and interviews on the ground with our fellow David Boris. We'll also be uploading all panels and keynotes, so please stay tuned and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Now, on to today's pod. Prime Minister Mark Carney recently completed a high-profile tour of the Indo-Pacific, which began in India and continued through Australia and Japan. In India, he met with Prime Minister Narendra Modi to reset a bilateral relationship that had been strained since 2023, following allegations linking India to the killing of a Canadian Sikh activist on Canadian soil. In Australia and Japan, Carney's discussions emphasized defense, maritime security, and advanced technology collaboration, reinforcing Canada's broader Indo-Pacific strategy to diversify partnerships and strengthen regional alliances. These developments set the stage for today's conversation, where we'll examine Canada's evolving role in the Indo-Pacific, the defense implications of deeper engagement, and the significance of the India reset for Canada's economic and security interests. To unpack the significance of Prime Minister Carney's trip, we're joined today by Jonathan Berkshire Miller, Rohinton Medhora, Vina Nadjibulla, and Mike Hughes. This is the Expert Series. To open up today's episode, we'll turn to Jonathan Berkshire Miller, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and co-founder and principal at Pendulum Geopolitical Advisory. Jonathan and I discussed Prime Minister Carney's Indo-Pacific trip, focusing on Japan as Canada's strategic anchor in the region, the deepening of Canada-Japan defense and security cooperation, and the concrete opportunities for Canadian industry under Canada's new defense industrial strategy. Jonathan, thanks for joining us once again. Wondering if you can perhaps provide some context for our listeners about this trip, why it's happening now, and what your initial takeaways and expectations are.
Well, thanks so much, Josh. It's always a pleasure to be back on the podcast. So a little bit of context here. This is Mark Carney's third trip to the region since he's became Prime Minister. He had his first longer trip to the region, which is for the multilateral summitry last fall, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation on the trade side, and the East Asia Summit on the political security side in ASEAN, Southeast Asian region. Subsequently, this year, he had a trip to China, which I think was well covered in the Canadian media, 4-day visit to China, and brought many of his ministers. This is sort of the third trip for Mark Carney to Asia. Why it's significant? I think there are three main stops on this trip. The first one being India, which I think has garnered a lot of attention. The second one, where he is right now, at least as we're recording, is Australia. And then the third leg is Japan. So I see this trip as consequential for a couple of reasons. First of all, these are three of the key democracies in the region, in a region that really doesn't have a whole lot of like-minded democracies. So the visits, starting with India, then going to Australia and Japan, is a chance for Canada to work very closely with like-minded allies. The second interesting point, of course, is from a bilateral perspective on the India relationship in particular. This is, as I mentioned, a democracy, but also one that we've had challenges in the relationship with foreign interference. And of course, the allegations of the Indian government being involved in a murder case in British Columbia. So the fact that Mark Carney is looking to recalibrate or reset relations with India, I think, is also one that we can dive into a little bit. And the final sort of point I would say, and I think this will come more in the Japan leg of the trip, is that Canada is now 3 years into an Indo-Pacific strategy, which we launched in 2022. And this government has been a little bit silent on the future of the Indo-Pacific strategy, how it will engage comprehensively in this region in that regard. So I think the Japan leg gives this government a chance to really refurbish or maybe re-energize its Indo-Pacific approach.
That's a great scene setter, Jonathan. And well, we'll get to India, the Japan leg, Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, whether that might need to be renewed, as well as the China visit. I actually think that that China visit might be uh, additional needed context for this visit as well. How would you interpret the sequencing of Prime Minister Carney's January 2026 visit to China, where a strategic partnership was announced with focus on energy, agri-food, trade stabilization, and that's followed now by his March trip to the Indo-Pacific, as you said, India, Australia, and Japan. Does this reflect a deliberate multi-track approach to diversification? And what are the implications of going from China to these three countries?
Well, I see this trip as a little bit of a chance to course correct in a way. I mean, first of all, I should say, I don't think it's a mistake that Mark Carney went to China. I think it's important to have dialogue and discussion with the Chinese side, even if we disagree with them on many areas, and we see them as rivals in many areas in security and even economically. So going to China, I don't think it was a mistake. However, I would not have used the language that he and his team have used with regard to strategic partnerships. Technically, in diplomatic terms, yes, at one point in time, there was a strategic partnership with China, again, in diplomatic terminology. But I don't think anyone would frame the current state of relations with Canada and China as reaching a strategic partnership lens. So I think that those sort of narratives, I think, were unhelpful. In addition to things such as framing a new world order, in a meeting with Xi Jinping. I mean, these things are unfortunate. Yet, I think some of the tactical things that happened in China, to be honest, I think are not so significant that they couldn't be rolled back. I think there was still a little bit of risk aversion in the way that Canada is engaging with China. Why this trip afterwards, I think, is important is that, look, the first trip that Mark Carney made was the two multilateral summits, as I mentioned. The second trip was a trip to China. Now this trip is really focused on countries that I think are more aligned with Canada's view in the region. India, of course, being the one caveat that there's challenges in that partnership. But I think this is a chance to sort of simmer or quiet some of the concerns that I think came out rightfully so after the China trip.
This trip also comes off the heels of Prime Minister Carney's now quite infamous Davos speech, where he sort of, some would say clear-eyed, but lamented the dissolution or fragmentation of the rules-based international order. And there was some not so veiled commentary there about the United States under President Trump. Do you think this visit at all could be understood within what's now being referred to as the Carney Doctrine?
I think there's a part of it for sure. So so the broader Carney Doctrine, there's the Davos speech, but I mean, even, as Carney himself got elected under the winds of being the man at the time to meet the challenge of Donald Trump and trade protectionism, et cetera. I think a big part of his doctrine is diversifying economically, working with other middle powers. He's obviously spent a lot of time since he's been prime minister abroad. A lot of that time has been in Europe. But I think some of the Asian countries where most of the economic growth globally still is are big targets for him. So in that sense, visiting India, of course, now the fourth biggest economy and rising, actually economic growth faster than China at this point in time. Japan, while its economic growth is not maybe significant, and in many sense it's been kind of in the decades of economic decline, and it's still one of the stronger economies in the world and the only G7 Asian country. And then Australia, a country that our pension funds have been long invested in and is a strong, stable ally in the region. I think a lot of that does fit in with his doctrine of diversifying. And in a way, what I would say too is that if you look closely at the Davos speech, I think many people rightfully so point out that this may have been aimed at the relationship with the United States, but he did reference generally authoritarian powers who are willing to push their weight around economically. And I think you could easily frame China in that lens too. So I think it can be definitely looked at in that light, and I think that it can fit in well with some of the principles that he outlined in Davos.
As you know, and as our audience will know, we had a major spat with India a few years ago under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a Canadian national, was assassinated in Canada by the Indian government. this caused, again, as we know, quite a significant diplomatic spat and kind of frayed the Canada-India relationship. Speaking again of the Carney doctrine, his pragmatism, is this resetting of relations, as it's being called with India, just that, something that's pragmatic? India is a growing economy, one of the largest in the world, an important player in the Indo-Pacific. And does it mean that, tensions between our countries are sort of resolved now, or is that economic question and the question of foreign interference, are they sort of separate issues that we need to kind of juggle in our relationship with India?
Well, I think the Carney administration is still sort of managing how it communicates on this point. So, I mean, one of the discussions, they're talking recalibration, reset, and I think for some Canadians, they may think, well, is this similar to China? We've had problems in the India relationship recently. We've had problems in the China relationship. I think there are a lot of differences. So I was happy that Mark Carney, when he was in Delhi, referenced that, look, this is a relationship that's not without challenges, but it's not fair to compare it to the China relationship, where the opportunities, I believe I'm paraphrasing him, but he said the opportunities in the India relationship are far greater than what we can do with China, just because there's, whether it's guardrails or however you want to frame it, there are things that we just simply can't, and it's not in our interest to do with China. So I think that's important too. Yes, I also don't want to say that, all the problems are going away on the security side. Foreign interference, I think, remains a challenge. So this was one of the controversies ahead of this trip that, apparently a senior official referenced that foreign interference is no longer an issue with India. I don't think we can wish away those issues. But at the same point, India is not an international or regional security challenge and threat for us. There are national security issues that I think are being addressed now at the bilateral track. But China, for example, is a global regional rival in many senses. It's a reality as well. But it's also a challenge to many of our allies and partners. And we see this, of course, in the region with Japan, with the Philippines. And we see this, of course, in the relationship with the United States, which has a very adversarial relationship with China. So I think the comparison is very different. So I am happy that Mark Carney referenced that, look, recalibration with India is still not without problems, but it is very different than comparing it to the relationship with the People's Republic of China.
Now, Jonathan, Prime Minister Carney will also be visiting Japan from March 6th to 7th, I believe. What are your main expectations for the Japan leg? And then particularly within that, maybe we could talk about security and defense cooperation, because that's on the agenda as well. What expectations are there around any joint efforts or statements on Indo-Pacific security, do you think?
Well, I think the Japan leg is really one of the key ones, even though it's the final leg of the trip. I think Japan really is the strategic anchor for Canada in the Indo-Pacific. As mentioned before, it's the only Indo-Pacific country in the G7. Almost every multilateral club that we're in globally has Japan in it. You're seeing on the security and defense side, number one, both countries simultaneously are starting to get more serious about their security and national defense. Canada, of course, like a lot of NATO allies, like most NATO allies, has agreed to the 5% increase on defense capabilities and infrastructure. Japan also is rapidly moving to increase its defense spending and I would say enhance its national security culture. So you're going to see a number of different evolutions there in Japan's own defense and intelligence structures in the coming years. So this has created an interesting atmosphere where there's a lot of opportunity and excitement in that relationship. We've seen some agreements such as logistics sharing agreements in recent years, recent intelligence sharing arrangement that's been finalized. And most recently, I think it was a couple months ago, an equipment and technology transfer sharing arrangement. So the building blocks of that defense and security relationship are evolving. And I think the next step, and we might see some movements actually during this trip, is to build up the industrial relationship between the two sides. Canada, with its new defense industrial strategy, is looking at opportunities to engage with new partners. And I think Japan, as it also starts to open its doors a little bit more, it's been a very, isolated defense market for a long time. And part of that goes back to history. But at this point, I think there's a big opportunity right now in the Canada-Japan defense relationship.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Jonathan, that's a great point. Canada just released its defense industrial strategy. Do you think you might be able to reflect or touch upon some of the most key or major opportunities that might exist there on the defense industrial side between both our countries?
Yeah, so I mean, generally in the region, I'll talk about first, and then I can talk at zero in on Japan. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunities. I would have hoped, every time you read a strategic document, there's always going to be complaints. I mean, there's some good things about that. There's some things that were left out. I think the Indo-Pacific is a real opportunity for Canada to be thinking about in defense industrial terms. The key country that I think most people are focusing on, maybe rightfully so, is South Korea, just because we're in the midst of a submarine procurement bid. And South Korea has the most developed and matured defense industrial capacity there. They've exported quite a bit before. But I don't think we should be overlooking Japan either. I mean, Japan it has been largely closed for many years, as I said, because of constitutional constraints and because it's so intermixed with the U.S. Defense ecosystem. But we've sort of been in a very similar perspective. So if we actually look at our relationship vis-a-vis Japan, yes, we export more. But we actually have been heavily reliant and very integrated with the U.S. Defense industrial base as well. So I think it actually provides a lot of opportunities potentially for us to do things even trilaterally with the United States. I think our capabilities match up very closely. So I see a real opportunity there for us to engage more with the new defense industrial strategy, the investment agency that's now out as well. So I think there are definitely opportunities.
We'll now turn to Rohinton Medhora, former president of CG and now professor of practice at McGill University's Institute for the Study of International Development, and then Vina Nadjibulla, vice president of research and strategy at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. In this segment, we'll unpack Canada-India relations, how Carney's visit has been characterized as reset, the deepening of bilateral trade, technology, and energy initiatives, and the establishment of a new defense dialogue. So, Rohinton, Carney's visit to India is being characterized as reset, particularly in light of tensions in our relationship over the past few years. And that was following the killing of an Indian Canadian on Canadian soil, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, followed by accusations of foreign interference. Could you maybe unpack and discuss that a bit for us? And from your perspective, does it appear as though this foreign interference is still a concern for the government?
So reset is absolutely the right word to use in this case because relations between the two countries had reached such a nadir for the reason you said, the murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil, that the only way forward was to reset. There wasn't a way to muddle through this one. Reset was not possible under the previous government and the previous Canadian Prime Minister. Prime Minister Mark Carney has come in with a fresh approach, a fresh relationship, and just the fact that he is not named Justin Trudeau and did not have the cabinet that Trudeau had has made a difference. The gesture he made, of course, the moves had started before, but the gesture he made to invite Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi to the G7 summit in Kananaskis got the current ball rolling and showed the goodwill and created the momentum that we have now seen culminating in Prime Minister Carney's visit to India. The second, however, and there's a however here, the second part of your question is equally germane, which is, is the bad news over? And I've said before to you, and I'll say it again, the answer is no. So long as the core friction between the views of the Sikh Indian diaspora in Canada and the views of the Indian government remain, we're going to see episodes of disagreement. Sometimes they may degenerate if there's violence, but there will always be this. That's a sort of longer-term structural issue. The short-term issue is that the trial of the suspect in the murder of Mr. Nijjar is upcoming. the evidence brought to it, we don't know what it will be and how much of it will be allowed to come into court. But both governments have positioned themselves in such a way that whatever evidence is presented, one government is going to be embarrassed. Therefore, we have to be prepared for some bumps as the trial proceeds and as leaks, as we've seen in the past week, have also happened. So present one side or the other. And so we're going to have to find a way to manage that angle while bulletproofing the larger relationship between the two countries. And that's the threading of the needle that the two prime ministers have embarked upon.
For you, Rohinton, what were the major takeaways from Prime Minister Carney's visit with Modi? What might the Prime Minister's trip say about the global economic and security environment right now, as well as both Canada and India's position within it?
I'd say the main takeaway was that blindingly obvious, but the world is not the world it was even 2 and 3 years ago for Canada and for India. India was positioning itself as, talk to us, we're not China. Canada was also secure in its historical relationship with the U.S., embedded in North American integration, good relations with Western Europe, the European Union, and middling relations with Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and most of Asia. What's changed is the rise of a movement, and it's not just related to Donald Trump, but a movement in the U.S. in which the U.S. sees for itself a much more nationalistic role, some might say a much more chauvinistic role. And that has affected both India and Canada. India thought it had a good relationship with the U.S. because it was the bulwark against China, and that has disintegrated. Canada, of course, we've seen the same thing. And so the two countries probably need each other more than they have ever before. This said, this is still the bilateral relationship between Canada and India is still a second-tier relationship. This will never be a globally important relationship because both countries have bigger and more important friends elsewhere. India, in its case, has its own neighborhood, Southeast Asia, the Gulf, the European Union, with whom it has signed a truly landmark trade agreement 2 weeks ago, and ultimately the U.S. Canada has its own large back and historic relationships. For all those reasons, I think what we saw is two countries trying to make the best of what has been a historically underperforming relationship. Second takeaway, more specific, that the trade, finance, investment, commerce, the economic side of the relationship is being played up. And I'd add, importantly, energy to that equation. The Prime Minister spent more time in India's commercial capital, Mumbai, than he did in its political capital, New Delhi. He did not go to Amritsar, the holy city of the Sikhs, where most, if not all, Canadian prime ministers have felt a need to go. And that signaling is very much about saying we would like a business and business-like relationship. Yes, values matter. Yes, culture and politics matter. But let's play up the other side so that there's more of a balance and we don't keep getting tripped up on events as historically has been the case.
What were some of the most significant outcomes outlined in the joint statement issued by Canada and India, Rohinton? And do you see India and Canada becoming stronger partners in the year ahead in areas like critical minerals, perhaps defense cooperation, in trade and energy? And then I have a second part of that question as well that maybe you can get to after. Would this all be bilateral, or is there perhaps scope for partnering on multilateral issues as the global governance system itself resets? So that's a big question. Take your time, but I look forward to hearing what you think.
So let me, Josh, to begin with your last question and then go through them all again, which is no, just about everything Canada and India do will be situated in a regional and global context. Uh, this is just not a relationship that's large enough or important enough bilaterally to matter otherwise. Now, you began by asking, what were the significant outcomes? The joint statement between that the two prime ministers issued at the end of the visit is a quite remarkable document. It's absolutely everything. Um, I counted about almost 24 separate thematic or geographic topics that were considered for the treatment. Everything from energy and critical minerals, which you mentioned, to climate, clean energy, sustainable agriculture, nutrition, talent, culture, S&T space, digital AI, security, defense, multilateral Indo-Pacific trade, investment, and that isn't even the complete list. Therefore, those that say, and I'm one of them, that this is an aspirational document, I believe are correct. What matters is execution. For now, we have a series of wouldn't it be nice to do's. And the question is, how will that play out? Not in the next 6 months or next year, actually in the next 5 to 10 years. This document, the joint statement, is actually a roadmap for how these two countries might comport with each other. Therefore, the relationship can only get bigger and improve if even half of what's in this document is actually acted upon by this and subsequent governments, then this would be a much larger relationship than it has historically been. I've said to you before that over the last 4 or 5 decades, this bilateral relationship has underperformed in every respect, economic and non-economic. This document lays out a plan to move to some kind of long-term average that's different. Specifically, there was precious little that one could point to, except in the energy sector. I think the uranium supply deal, which is about providing a guaranteed access to India, to Saskatchewan's uranium through Cameco, its uranium production and marketing company, over 8 years, provides a security of supply to India for its energy needs and aspirations. And there were a series of smaller deals along those lines, all of them in the energy sector. I think that's where the two countries are focused. And that speaks to, and this is my final point on this one, that speaks to the supply chain resilience theme that both countries are keen on. It speaks to a second theme that both countries are keen on, which is that economics and security go hand in hand. Industrial development and security go hand in hand. And so the sense that prosperity and security are two sides of the same coin is now playing out through the energy channel. Your final point was about how much of this is only bilateral. And here I'd say that although bilateral is important, Canada and India could be doing more multilaterally. So Prime Minister Carney's speech in Davos, in the sort of the comfort zone for him of Davos, was a very good speech, well crafted, well delivered. But if you want to execute on its main theme, which is middle powers need to get together and create a new and different global order, then surely exhibits A and B in middle powers would be Canada and India. And so be it energy governance, be it the governance of new technologies, be it debt, be it rejuvenating the WTO, there's a series of issues in which Canada and India could lead the way if, in fact, we were serious about this. And when I look at the joint statement of the Prime Minister and look at the various themes that they cover, any one of these themes could and should also be a regional or multilateral team. And I'd argue that the bilateral manner in which the two countries treat this would actually be a subset of the global rules of the game. And it's the global rules of the game that matter for countries like Canada and India.
Vina, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
So before we dive into this conversation, I'm wondering if you might be able to unpack for us Prime Minister Carney's recent trip to the Indo-Pacific, what you think the broader context was of that trip, why it's happening now, and maybe what you think were some of the key successes or major takeaways from Prime Minister Carney's time in Asia.
Yeah, so this trip was part of his broader agenda to diversify Canada's economic and strategic partnerships. The Indo-Pacific is an important part of the world. That's where most of the economic growth is happening, technological innovation is happening, and of course, it's also a part where the geopolitical competition between U.S. and China is really playing out. So we have an Indo-Pacific strategy. Canada has been trying to deepen relations in this part of the world for the last 3 to 4 years, and Prime Minister Carney's visit was really building on that, but also trying to take his middle power diplomacy and his Davos speech recommendations to this part of the world, especially with Japan and Australia, which are fellow democracies, like-minded countries with whom we're already doing a lot. I think this was an opportunity for him to build on his Davos speech and to translate that into local realities. With India, I think the objectives were much broader. It was about consolidating the reset and the repair in the relationship that Prime Minister Carney began when he came into the office. And we absolutely saw him be able to achieve that in terms of turning the page on the challenging part of the relationship with India and focusing on the broader partnership. On the main takeaways, there was a lot. I should also note that a lot of the trip was overshadowed by the developments in Iran. So it wouldn't be surprising if a number of your listeners kind of missed major highlights because Iran obviously was also very much on the agenda. So he was in the Indo-Pacific, but dealing quite a bit with the Middle East.
Yes, we actually meant to release this last week, but instead opted to do an episode on Iran instead. So it's good to catch up on it. As you mentioned, Vina, Prime Minister Carney's visit was described as a reset and a deepening of the Canada-India relationship. Could you touch on some of the initiatives that were worked out during that visit? And then building on that, he didn't publicly address it, but there were ongoing concerns of allegations of Indian interference and related security issues well ahead of this, which is kind of what happened to this thaw in our relationship. I'm wondering if you can speak to that as well, and maybe what the current administration's perception of India is vis-a-vis security.
Yeah, so it was interesting because if you were following the trip from India, then it was absolutely a story of a reset and all the positive developments, the various MOUs and agreements that were signed. But the coverage of Prime Minister Carney's India trip in Canada was still very much focused on foreign interference and transnational repression and the concerns that exist in Canada. So it really was a tale of two visits in some ways. But on the kind of the positive or on what was actually achieved. So there was a joint statement that Prime Minister Carney and Modi put out, which lays out kind of a roadmap lays out a plan for where the relationship is heading. And it has not just focus on economic issues and trade and investment, which is understandable given the complementarity of our economies and the importance of trade diversification. But what I thought was interesting in the joint statement was that security and defense were noted as a foundational layer of the relationship. So the ambition here is that Canada and India will have a robust security and defense partnership as well. And that is new. That is something that many did not expect in the relationship. So on the security and defense side, there's now a security and law enforcement mechanism that has been set up at the level of national security advisors to deal with the challenges in the relationship. So foreign interference and transnational repression for Canada, as well as extremism and organized crime and terrorism from a perspective of India. So they have their own concerns that they want to raise. And that is, like I said, head by the national security advisors. They also agreed to have liaison officers, national security and law enforcement liaison officers in each other's high commissions in Delhi and Ottawa. And we'll see, because progress on that is going to be absolutely critical, Josh, for anything else to move forward in the relationship. Because it's fine to say we have a reset and we have complementary economies and there's a lot of economic benefits for us to do things together. But if we don't address this sensitive issues in the relationship, it would be difficult for the reset to be enduring. And then there's also the defense dialogue that was launched, which looks broader than obviously the security concerns. It looks at doing things together on maritime security, maritime domain awareness, doing things together in the Indo-Pacific, both in the kind of in the Indian Ocean area, but also Southeast Asia and the Pacific, kind of the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, which was part of our original idea before the crisis with India happened. If you recall, in our Indo-Pacific strategy, we named India as a critical partner. India, of course, has its own approach to a free and open Indo-Pacific. So that's kind of coming back to that original idea. And then there is the sort of the desire to explore defense industrial cooperation. And that is a follow-up to our defense industrial strategy that was just launched a few weeks ago. While it didn't name India explicitly, India is one of the largest buyers of arms around the world. I mean, obviously, given their security context, and they have deep partnerships with France, European Union, and the US when it comes to defense industrial cooperation. And I think Canada wants to see if we can do more there, including around airspace, space, satellite, dual-use technologies, AI, quantum, cyber. So it's a whole slew of areas that has been listed. And the defense attachés have been now also committed to be based in Delhi and Ottawa. So I think it's the beginning of partnership in this area, but we'll see how far it goes, given that there's not a lot of history of us doing things together with India. There's not a lot of strategic trust between our various defense agencies and actors. So we'll see.
Canada is looking to diversify its defense partnerships. You brought up India, but we're looking to diversify beyond the United States and Europe. How important, if at all, would you say the Indo-Pacific is if Canada is really truly serious about growing its defense industry and diversifying?
So I think Indo-Pacific is absolutely critical. And of course, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Singapore, potentially even Indonesia. I think those are the countries that come to mind when we think of us doing more in the region, in the defense industrial sector. I think India is one that has tremendous potential, but a lot of other things would need to fall into place before we see deeper engagement. Just last week, I was in Delhi for a Track 1.5 dialogue on defense industrial cooperation. And my takeaway from that is, I mean, we organized it, and my takeaway is that there's a lot of potential, but we need to do quite a bit of groundwork in rebuilding trust and maybe doing things on a kind of a multilateral regional basis first around maritime domain awareness, maritime security might be better entry than going straight into defense industrial cooperation.
Vina, earlier on, you brought up the Indo-Pacific strategy, which, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe was released in 2022 now. Given that so many changes have happened in the world and for Canada's own security situation since the release of that document, do you think that that strategy needs to be or is probably going to be updated sometime soon? Or do you think the findings and recommendations from that strategy are still hold pretty well about 3 to 4 years on now?
Yeah, so the strategy was released in November of 2022, and it was a 5-year plan with a commitment to obviously evaluate it and have a second phase 5 years on. It had a budget of $2.3 billion, and that also was a kind of a 5-year investment with an understanding that we'll have another commitment for the next 5 years. So I think in that sense, what would be relevant is to start thinking about that next phase, because we're sort of at that time now. So the kind of what comes for the next 5-year plan. But for the moment, though, I think the strategy, especially its focus on peace and security, sort of, as well as the economic and trade relations in the region are absolutely valid. We are seeing that, in fact, the diversification of partnerships is even more relevant now. And given that we had a head start in the region with the strategy, now we have to build on that momentum and focus and prioritize. So I think the strategy is still very much valid. What is necessary now is to prioritize and to deepen relations with key partners like Japan, Australia, South Korea, rebuild relations with India, and do much more in Southeast Asia, which is what we were already and planning as part of the Indo-Pacific strategy. So it's relevant. It fits now into the broader diversification agenda, and it fits now more into this kind of middle power diplomacy that Prime Minister Carney is pushing on the global stage. So yes, I would say that the focus should be on just implementing it, moving forward, and then as part of the next 5-year plan, reprioritizing and reviewing the pieces around China and India that do need updating.
So, Vina, we briefly discussed here what necessitates Canada's sort of pivot to the Indo-Pacific, Carney's Davos speech, the India-Canada reset in defense cooperation. Do you have any final thoughts about the Prime Minister's trip, or are there any key takeaways or final messages you'd like to leave our audience with before we wrap up here today?
Sure. So we focus quite a bit on India, but I should say that his short trip to Japan was also extremely significant. And it really, I think, elevated the relationship. We now have a comprehensive strategic partnership with Japan. Japan is going through a generational transformation when it comes to its own security and defense posture. I think there is endless opportunities for Canada to partner with Japan, to exchange views on the security environment in the North Pacific and the Arctic, to share information now that we have the various agreements in place that allow us to do that, both in terms of transfer of defense technology as well as sharing of information, intelligence with Japan. So I think we're entering a new chapter and much more dynamic and exciting chapter of partnering with Japan. It's a relationship that's so stable and so calm that it risks being overlooked. And I think we really need to pay a lot more attention, because there's a ton that we can do on defense and security, as well as on economic security and broader partnership with perhaps the most consequential partner for us in the region.
To close out the episode, we'll turn to the Australia leg of Prime Minister Carney's Indo-Pacific trip with Mike Hughes, Director of the Defense Strategy Program at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Mike, I'm hoping you might be able to offer your remarks or predictions about the Carney visit to Australia. I believe he landed in Canberra last night. This is part of a multi-stage, multi-week trip that Mr. Carney is taking. He's visiting India, Japan, Australia, the Indo-Pacific partners. This, of course, comes off the heels of a rather infamous Davos speech now, where Mr. Carney outlined what he saw as the fraying of the international U.S.-based order and the need for Canada to pivot towards other multilateral alliances and have, a sort of clear-eyed or pragmatic view in the world today. It also comes off the heels of a renewed relationship with China and India. So observers are really interested in seeing what is going to be made of the Carney visit to Australia. I'm wondering if you'd first like to start by maybe contextualizing and speaking from the Australian perspective, if there is one.
I think for a lot of Australians, Canada is seen as a friendly, trusted country that probably we think looks a lot like us when we sort of look at it from across the Pacific. We're sort of large countries, relatively small populations by comparison. We're liberal democracies. We share similar values. Canada hasn't actually, even though it has been a member of the Five Eyes, obviously, or is a member of the Five Eyes, I should say, hasn't really had a strong presence in the minds of a lot of national security officials who focus on the Indo-Pacific from an Australian perspective. I think Canada is seen largely as an Atlantic power, a country that leans more towards the Atlantic than the Indo-Pacific. There are exceptions, obviously, but I think that's where there's a bit of excitement about, well, what more can Australia and Canada do together here in the Indo-Pacific, which of course is the region that matters most to Australia. So I think going back to the Davos speech, that really put Canada in the headlights. I think a kudos to Prime Minister Carney. I got to say, my constant criticism of Australian governments of all political persuasions has been that they don't talk to the Australian people enough about what's going on in the world. We have a term in Australia that we call social license. Basically what underpins a government's ability to do stuff in terms of the electorate's support. That's what the social license is. But that social license requires governments to actually talk to their people about what's going on in the world. And so when Prime Minister Carney made his speech at Davos, I think there are a lot of Australians that really liked that, just for the sheer fact that, hey, here's a leader of a liberal democracy who's not just talking to his own electorate, but he's talking to the world about what is happening. And that definitely got a lot of attention as a result. And I think there was a lot of support to that. And again, what Prime Minister Carney had to say in that speech, there was a lot to like. I, for one, am someone who does believe that, for me, the global order is dead. At the moment, the second Trump administration came to power, and it made clear that it was walking away from that framework, that it no longer believed the global order was working in its interest, the post-1945 global order, that is. For me, that meant that order was dead, because the United States had been the primary architect of that order, and most importantly, it had been the primary guarantor of that order. So to take the US out is basically like ripping the spine out of a body. It can't stand up on its own anymore. So, definitely appreciated that part of Prime Minister Carney's speech. And I guess his articulation of a middle power way really is, the only other option for so-called middle powers. And I should note that, I personally, I don't really like the term middle power, because the middle is exceptionally large, and it's very difficult to define what is a middle power. There's great diversity in that middle power band. I think basically you have great powers, and then you've got the rest. And unfortunately for Canada and Australia, we're part of the rest. I think the other thing about Prime Minister Carney's speech was, there was great sympathy for Canada. I think particularly here in Australia, and I'd imagine for most of what we would call the Western world, the way that the second Trump administration, and particularly President Trump, has treated Canada, really just induces quite a bit of revulsion. I don't need to get too emotional about that, but I think, we look at how the US is treating Canada, how it's treated Denmark and NATO as a whole, and that does not instill confidence in the United States as an effective partner. It certainly erodes trust, which has been an absolutely critical part of the US-led order. And I'd say it's, trust has been an absolutely critical part of US international power. So for those of us like myself who do believe in the US alliance, who do believe in the role of the US as a benign hegemon, there's a lot that's happened over the last 12 months that has eroded our confidence in the US's ability to continue playing the powerful role, the positive role that it has been playing in the post-1945 world. And, my fear is that, far from making America great again, a continuance of this sort of behavior by the second Trump administration simply makes America weaker over time, and exposes the West, or makes the West collectively weaker against those who truly seek to do us harm, which here in the Indo-Pacific is the Chinese Communist Party, where Australia has its own experience of what it means to raise the ire of the Communist Party. So look, yeah, a lot to love about Prime Minister Carney's speech, but I'd say that the key gap for me did not mention China. Yes, there's a lot to criticise about the current US administration, and again, recognising, of course, that Canada has copped a lot, whereas Australia has got off, relatively lightly. But I think trying to articulate a middle power way that gives middle powers, for want of a better term, greater autonomy from the US, completely accept that. But I think there's real questions to be asked about, well, what substantively can middle powers actually do? Australia went through 5 years of brutal economic punishment from China, and our fellow middle powers did very little, if anything, to help us in that time of need. That I would just offer as simply one example of why there might be some doubt about the substance of Prime Minister Carney's speech. But again, to get back to, finally, after meandering through this, back to the core of your question, I think that's why there is such interest in his visit here to Australia, because people are looking for, well, what's the substance? This visit, if anything, should be delivering on the hope and delivering some form of substance to what is the middle power way when Canada and Australia get together.
Our prime ministers are meeting. We've been having this conversation about middle powers and the need for middle powers to support each other. And given Australia's needs and security interests in the Indo-Pacific and more generally, could you maybe discuss ways in which Canada could be a good ally in the Indo-Pacific, particularly with Australia, and whether that's joint naval exercises or through economics or through defense technology sharing partnerships? Is there any way we can help Australia achieve its security needs?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think starting from a sort of a core base, Canada and Australia have very similar interests. We want a stable and prosperous Indo-Pacific. It's for both of our countries and quite frankly for the globe. The Indo-Pacific is the key region for this century. It's sort of driving roughly about 60% of global GDP. It has over half of global trade, and really has become the fulcrum of geostrategic competition, typified by Sino-US competition. So, the future of this century will be determined here, and particularly, I guess, for Australia. The big economies of the Indo-Pacific are in Northeast Asia. We're talking, China, Japan, Korea. I guess from an Australian perspective, our largest trading partners are all there or deeply integrated there. So, China's our largest trading partner, followed by the US, then Japan, then South Korea. So, those four countries pretty much account for about, I think, 50% or just over 50% of total Australian trade, obviously vital to our economy. So just as an example of how deeply embedded Australia is in the region, and I guess what Canada can offer. First of all, it's a trusted entity and a fellow liberal democracy. Sort of values, and I guess societal values are important. I think I mentioned social license earlier. One of the key concerns I have about our relationship with the US during the second Trump administration is that there are many in Australian society who are, I think, are questioning whether we share the same values with the US anymore. And the longer that goes on, and the greater doubt there is, the more difficult the social license is for any Australian government to continue doing productive things with the United States. I think when it comes to Canada, it's at the other end of the spectrum. The Australian government will have a tremendous amount of social license to do things with Canada, precisely because, in general, the Australian people look at Canada as a fellow liberal democracy sharing similar values. So that does matter. I think, however, when both Canada and Australia look at the Indo-Pacific, we need to accept that our values as liberal democracies are not necessarily, they're certainly not shared widely in the Indo-Pacific, and they don't necessarily resonate here. So, the region is not a region that we come to necessarily seeking to promote those values because the audience doesn't necessarily want to hear about it. So for Australia, the Indo-Pacific can be a very lonely place to be as a liberal democracy. If we look to our south, we've got New Zealand, which is shares very similar values to us. But when we look north, there are fellow democracies, but they're not by any means liberal democracies. And therefore, Canada is one of those very few countries, bordering the Indo-Pacific that we share those sort of common values with. So there's definitely a core value there. I think when you then start narrowing into, okay, so what is it that we can do, and I guess primarily in the defence space, we are already doing some things in common. So Canada has participated in freedom of navigation activities in the Indo-Pacific, which basically are all about reminding China that there are rules to follow, and that we reject some of the grandiose revanchist claims that China makes in the region. Canada has participated in exercises with the Philippines, for example, which is a key Southeast Asian country, particularly for Australia. Again, a Southeast Asian country that certainly shares a lot of our interests that Canada and Australia have in common. Interest in a free and open Indo-Pacific, interest in a rules-based multilateral trading system. The fact that Canada has already been participating in military exercises with countries like the Philippines speaks to where our common interests lie. So in terms of looking forward to what would we hope might be in the future of the bilateral relationship between Australia and Canada, I think we need to look at a deepening of that. A deepening integration between our defence and security systems, which would range from greater exercising. We always welcome Canada to exercise Talisman Sabre, for example, but I think a greater familiarity between our militaries, and particularly in the maritime domain. Again, Australia has embarked on an exceptionally large naval shipbuilding program. Obviously, we have AUKUS, which will, the centre of which is delivering us nuclear-powered submarines. But we have, the Hunter-class frigates. We have the Megami frigate decision made last year, where we'll have the Japanese building a new class of frigates for us. We have investment in defence infrastructure, particularly in Western Australia on the border of the Indian Ocean. And I think there's lots of opportunities here for Australia and Canada to deepen their cooperation and integration around these issues. And then broadening out a bit, and I think this is on the agenda for when our two prime ministers meet, is broader cooperation in the economic security zone, and particularly when it comes to things like critical minerals, where obviously China sort of dominates upwards of 90% of that market. I think Australia and Canada have, again, one of the other things we have in common is we're very good at mining, we're very good at digging stuff out of the ground. Unfortunately, what we also have in common is that we're actually pretty poor at the downstream processing and manufacturing. We tend to dig stuff up and then we basically hand it over to China to process. So I could see there's lots of potential there for Australia and Canada to talk about how do we improve our supply chain security, how do we improve our ability to contribute to fellow liberal democracies and other partners, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, who share our interests, and how do we contribute to greater resilience, particularly with our respective economies, in light of what's happening in the great power space between China and the United States.
And that's all for today's episode. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email josh@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.